Greetings, APUSH scholars. I'm looking at the APUSH review for Unit 1 on Native Americans, Exploration, Discovery, and Colonization. I'm going to be going over the review sheet from top to bottom, point by point here. First of all, Cahokia. Cahokia was the most influential urban settlement of the Mississippian culture. It's the most complex archaeological site north of Mexico. Cahokia is a pre-Columbian Native American city on the Mississippi River across from current-day St. Louis, and it was about 3.5 square miles in size, had about 40,000 people, and it's known for its big mound, which had a city and a worship site and trade on top. And this is about 400 years before Columbus, and it's kind of evidence of a relatively complex Indian civilization long before the Europeans arrived. Mexican Indians versus Indians north of Mexico. The big difference is that the Indians north of what would be current-day Mexico were more decentralized and more nomadic or semi-nomadic, whereas the Aztecs had a king and ruled over an extensive civilization with tribes being sold as slaves and providing tribute, and the Aztecs had pyramids and armies and empire. The North American Indians, the hundreds and hundreds of tribes, basically only loosely confederated, if at all. Differences between these Indians and their interaction with their environment. The Plains Indians, the Plains Indians are famous for hunting buffalo. They used buffalo for food, for clothing, for shelter, and when the Spanish arrived, they adopted Spanish horses to ease their hunts. Northeastern woodland Indians, they grew corn in the summer, and they fished if they were near water, which they almost always were, near lakes or the ocean or rivers. And in the winter, they became semi-nomadic in that they hunted down large game, such as deer. So sort of stable in the summer, growing corn, and then moving around looking for game. Southwest Indians, in what would be sort of the desert Southwest, they used irrigation from the rivers to grow corn in the river valleys, and one of the examples that is in your history book are the Pueblo or the Anasazi in New Mexico. The Pacific Northwest Indians fished on the rivers such as the Columbia, which were abundant with salmon, and they would dry the salmon, which would help provide protein through the rest of the year. Model of Christian Charity is the name of a sermon by Puritan preacher John Winthrop, and the nickname of this sermon is called The City on a Hill. And the call here by Winthrop to the Puritan community is to be a witness in the spiritual darkness to England's Anglican Church. And the goal here is that this Christian community created by the Puritans would be an example, would be a model, would be something that would draw people to pure worship to Jesus Christ himself. And in this sermon, he calls for Christian charity is what will characterize this community, especially good treatment by the well-off to those who are poorer. Difference between the purpose of settling Jamestown versus the later settling of Massachusetts. Jamestown, 1607, basically settled by English gentlemen looking for gold, looking for silver. They want to model themselves on the Spanish, who plundered the Aztecs and the Incas. And Jamestown, of course, does not find any gold or silver. Massachusetts is characterized by families coming over for religious freedom. The Puritans had been persecuted by the Church of England. The Puritans had been fined. They had been jailed. They had even been branded. They'd been whipped. They'd been executed. So they're coming over for religious freedom. They built this city on a hill. Another name for the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are the separatists. Remember, the separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England. The Puritans, who are coming over 13 years later, want to stay in the church, but they want to purify it. Which church were the Pilgrims and Puritans fleeing? They're fleeing the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was too Catholic. Remember, this is the church that breaks off from the Catholic Church when Henry VIII wants a divorce. It's originally formed for totally non-spiritual reasons. And in many ways, the Anglican Church is kind of the Catholic Church right. It still had bishops, which is called an episcopal system of government, and bishops were appointed by the king himself. And they still had, vestments and incense and crucifixes and candles and statues and things which didn't seem to take the focus perhaps off of Scripture, off of what the Puritans thought was a pure church. The purpose for the founding of Harvard University. Harvard University was founded to train Puritan ministers to preach the Scriptures, and Harvard University taught Greek and taught Latin and taught Hebrew and taught homiletics and taught theology and taught the Bible. What was the foundation of Puritan truth and behavior? The Scriptures, a correct interpretation of the Bible. The Old Deluder Act of 1647, the Old Deluder is Satan. And the idea here is that every community of 50 people or more was supposed to provide a local teacher to teach the children to read the Scriptures so that they would not be deluded by the temptations of Satan. The Halfway Covenant is an agreement in the New England church, specifically the Massachusetts church, on what to do with people who had been baptized as children, who grew up in the church, got married, but then have left the church. They haven't darkened the door of a church building in a long time, but they've gotten married and have had children themselves. And they come back to church wanting their babies baptized. And the Halfway Covenant is a deal where the babies will be baptized, but the parents cannot receive communion. They're excluded from full membership in a church which they have not supported or attended. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. What happened? Well, out on the frontier with the Indians, the poor whites were being attacked or having conflicts with the Indians. They say they were being attacked, but they're also doing the attacking. Conflict over frontier land with the Indians. And it is former indentures. It is the very poor. It's people who can't afford the more fertile land along the coast. And they're rebelling because of Indian attacks, but they're also being excluded from participation in the House of Burgesses in Jamestown because they're poor, but they're being taxed. So there's this feeling that there's this terrible injustice being perpetrated on them. And they organize under the leadership of Nathaniel Bacon, who marches on Jamestown and who burns it to the ground. And soldiers are sent, and the aristocracy on the coast will crush Bacon's rebellion not before he dies himself of illness. Similar rebellions before the American Revolution. One of the things the AP wants you to see is that there's not just a rebellion of America against Great Britain, but there's rebellions within the colonies of whites against whites, largely poor against the rich. There's economic discontent, such as Bacon's Rebellion. Leisler's Rebellion took place in New York in 1689. This is where the provincial militia basically took control of New York after King James II was removed by Parliament, what's called the Glorious Revolution. If you remember your world history, you have a series of kings who, James I and Charles I, are these very autocratic Anglican rulers who are deposed. Well, Charles II is deposed by Parliament. Not really deposed, that's not really the word. There's a rebellion and a war, and he's captured and he's executed. But and then Oliver Cromwell sets up a Puritan dictatorship. Two new kings are put in power after Oliver Cromwell. That would be Charles II and James II. James II is an open Catholic. There's fear that he's going to pull the church back in, or England back into the Catholic Church's orbit. And Parliament has another uprising, this one bloodless, and they bring over William and Mary. And James II had been ruling very autocratically through his governor, Mr. Andros, in New York City, and the people who had been felt that they had been oppressed and exploited by James II and his minions are rebelling. The Paxton Boys in 1763, about 250 settlers march on Philadelphia to protest that the governor has not been protecting them from Indian attacks. And there's a case where after the French and Indian War, where there were lots of Indian attacks along the frontier, some revenge is made on some peaceful Indians by the border settlers, and the governor had ordered their arrest for basically slaughtering a village of Christianized peaceful Indians, and they felt that this was wrong, and they were going to march on the Capitol. And Ben Franklin is actually the person who goes out and sort of cools them down and says that their complaints will be addressed. The regulators, this is an uprising in North Carolina between 1764 and 1771, and these are against settlers who are refusing to pay unjust taxes. These are people back in the Piedmont and the Hill Country in the interior who are protesting dishonest Eastern officials who are not letting them participate in government and who are taxing them. And these protesters, the regulators, are seeking reforms. And they are also, like Bacon's Rebellion, crushed by the governor and his militia. Indian revolts, you should know the Pueblo Revolt. This is a revolt against the Spanish in 1680 down in the southwest. 400 Spanish were killed, 2,000 were driven out, and the Indians made a very deliberate attempt to remove Christianity. They felt that the Spanish Catholic conquistadores and their soldiers and settlers were disrespectful and condescending and insulting towards Indian culture and language and traditions, and they wanted the Spanish out. Very successful rebellion for quite a number of years. The Pequot War, well, first let's go back to the Powhatan Wars. These are conflicts between the Jamestown settlers and the Virginian Indians next door to Jamestown, and it's basically argument over expansion into Indian land, and the Powhatans are the losers in this war. The Pequot War is in Massachusetts Bay, 1634 through 1638, and about 700 Pequots are killed or sold into slavery by the English colonists. Again, this is over frontier dispute of land as the English are relentlessly moving onto Indian land. In King Philip War is a couple decades later, 1675 through 78, also in Massachusetts, also through other places in New England, such as Connecticut. And King Philip is the English nickname given to Chief Metacom, M-E-T-A-C-O-M. Metacom, you'll see it spelled King Philip or Metacom. And this is in proportion to their numbers, or the numbers killed. This is maybe the bloodiest war, I suppose in American history, but certainly on the East Coast settlement here. About 10% of all Englishmen of military age were slaughtered, as 12 towns were burnt to the ground, many more damaged. About half of all towns in New England were attacked by the Indians. And again, it's a dispute ultimately over expansion into Indian land and unfair treaties being forced upon them. The effect of geography on the economy of Chesapeake. Chesapeake is Virginia and Maryland, and the big thing you should know here is export crops, things such as tobacco and indigo. Cotton is not a big crop until after the cotton gin, which is after the American Revolution. So on an AP test, do not start talking about cotton in this time period. New England had, most people were farmers, and they were subsistence farmers, didn't have the big plantations you had in the more alluvial delta soil in Chesapeake, where the rivers entered into the bay. The soil was a lot stonier, a lot rockier. But what happened in New England was what really propelled the economy was trade with Africa and with Europe, fishing, shipbuilding, ship repair, manning ships, and anything dealing with sort of a transatlantic trade. The middle colonies, in many ways similar to the South, had plantations, had slaves, and similar to the North in that they were also seafarers and traders. Think of the cities of New York City, and Philadelphia. The middle colonies are Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, and they are known for their diversity, both in nationality. You've got Dutch in New York, you've got Swedes in Delaware, you've got Germans, you've got large numbers of Jews in New York City, and the effect of religion on Massachusetts. Remember, Massachusetts is settled by the Pilgrims and later by the Puritans, and the goal here is to make this covenant community of faithful believers who will be rewarded for their faithfulness. God will bless their endeavors, and they'll be a light to the nations and certainly to the Anglican Church back in Great Britain. Maryland is settled by Catholics. The Act of Toleration allowed religious freedom to all those who profess the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Pennsylvania was settled by Quakers, by William Penn, and the Quakers, remember, are this sort of odd religious group who sort of are following the Sermon on the Mount. They're pacifists. They don't take oaths. They were the early opponents of slavery. The Quakers believed in treating the Indians fairly. They allowed women to participate in worship, and they did not have ministers. New York is settled by all sorts of people who are refugees from Europe. You've got German pietists, you've got German Lutherans, you've got Portuguese Jews, you've got basically the key thing for New York and Pennsylvania is they allowed religious freedom for everyone, along with Maryland. Basically, Massachusetts is the one place where you're not welcome if you're not a Puritan. Rhode Island is settled for religious freedom by Roger Williams after he got kicked out of Massachusetts for a number of things. One is he said there should be no compulsion, no coercion in religious worship, and this threatened the very basis of the Puritan state, that the state should enforce godly, holy laws. And Roger Williams also criticized the poor treatment of the Indians. He also challenged what was called the Charter. The Puritans had been given permission to worship by the government, permission to settle, and Roger Williams didn't believe that the king had any right to give permission to worship, let alone the Puritans interfering with anyone's worship. And this seemed to be provoking sort of a sleeping tiger across the ocean. Why challenge the kings granting them this permission to worship as they wish? Anne Hutchinson was what you call an antinomian. She believed that you did not have to follow any laws to be any religious laws to be a Christian. And she felt all these laws that were being enforced by the Puritans in New England were against conscience. And she got the boot along with Roger Williams. She, like Roger Williams, believed in separation of church and state. And the big deal again here for Massachusetts is God's not going to bless them if people can do whatever they want, including violating the Sabbath and doing as they wish. They must obey as a community God's laws as interpreted by the Puritan community based upon the Bible. Mercantilism is the system of trade in which the colonies exist to better the mother country. Specifically here, the English colonies are a source of raw goods, of supplies to be turned into manufactures back in Great Britain. And to this end, they enumerated goods which the colonies could not make. They could not make things like woolen hats. They could not manufacture iron. These things were supposed to be exports from Great Britain. The idea is to keep money in sort of a hermetically sealed system here. The colonies provide the raw goods, and they receive manufactured goods from Great Britain. Everyone's supposed to benefit. There's a guaranteed market for the Americans, and of course there's protection by the British Navy. The Navigation Acts are the laws which would enforce mercantilism. The Navigation Acts basically said you could only trade with Great Britain on British ships. And this is meant to shut out the Dutch, to shut out the French, to shut out certainly the Spanish and the Portuguese. The idea here is that this is a zero-sum game. If money leaks out, if you're buying from someone else, that's less money in your own system. You've lost wealth. And of course, this all changes later with Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations and the idea that free trade benefits everyone. But mercantilism is a trade restriction, government-regulated trade. Salutary neglect refers to the fact that even though back in the mid-1600s you've got this mercantile system supposedly enforced by the Navigation Acts, the Americans ignored it to their salutary or healthy neglect. The Americans were trading pretty much with whomever they jolly well pleased, and the Americans were getting the benefit of everything. They're selling to the other nations, they're selling to the Brits, they're receiving protection from the British Navy, and they're getting the best of all worlds, and they're certainly being taxed much less than their cousins back in England. The cause of the American Revolution, in short, is going to be once the French are finally driven out of North America and this huge debt has to be paid, the British are going to look at the Americans, about 2.5 million of them, who are prospering without paying many taxes, basically totally ignoring the Navigation Acts, and they're going to start putting the squeeze on the Americans to comply. But salutary neglect is this neglect which is basically healthy for the Americans economically. Differences between Spanish and English settlements in North America. As far as religion, in the Southwest, where the Spanish settled down in what would be New Mexico, Arizona, California, Texas, the Indians are being converted to the Catholic faith. And the Puritans and the Jamestown settlers did have some mission work to the Indians, but it wasn't very successful, and the Indians largely did not convert at all. Treatment of the Indians, the New Englanders excluded the Indians. The Indians were not among the saints. They were not among the elect. They were not among those who were predestined. The Calvinist, Protestant settlers, to a large extent, shunned the Indians, where the Catholics intermarried. The Catholics brought them into the Catholic Church, into their homes in a very literal way, and you have a whole race of mestizos, half Indians, half Spaniards, basically becoming the majority in Mexico and much of what would be Central America. Politics, you have in Spanish America viceroys. These are representatives